Before we dive into this, I need to give you a heads up. This story isn't for the faint of heart. It's raw, real, and deals with some heavy stuff. The struggles of being a new mom, the complexities of family, and, yeah, infidelity. If that's not your cup of tea, now's the time to click away. My name's Bray Sheffer, and I'm 42. Looking at my life today, you might call it a mess, but I've come to terms with it. If you'd told me a decade ago that this is where I'd end up, I'd have laughed in your face. No way. But here I am, sitting at my kitchen table on a quiet morning, staring into a half-empty coffee cup, trying to make sense of the last 10 years. It's like trying to catch smoke with my bare hands, nothing solid, just fragments of memories and emotions. For the past 8 years, it's just been me and my son, Maximus. After the divorce, we became a team of two, facing the world together, even when it felt like the world was against us. I remember when it all started, when his dad walked out. Maximus was only 10 back then. He didn't cry, not in front of me, anyway. He never does. But I could see it in the way he carried himself, in the way he'd stare out the window, like he was waiting for his dad to come back, even though somewhere deep down, he probably knew it wasn't going to happen. Day after day, he'd wait, and day after day, I'd watch the hope drain from his face. It broke my heart. The day his father left, I made myself a promise. I'd do whatever it took to make sure Maximus never felt alone. I'd be his rock, his safe place, his family, even if it was just the two of us. That promise has been my anchor ever since, the thing that keeps me going when everything feels like it's falling apart. It hasn't been easy, but I've tried my best to give him stability, love, and support, no matter what life throws our way. For a long time, I thought I was doing okay. Maximus was such a sweet kid, kind, quiet, always helping out around the house. There was something about him, something gentle and thoughtful that set him apart from other kids. But as he got older, things started to change. He changed, and if I'm being honest, so did I. It's like we were both shifting in ways I couldn't quite understand. Maximus turned 18 this year, and it felt like a huge milestone for both of us. He's not a little boy anymore, but he's still figuring out what it means to be a man. It's not an easy transition, and I can see him wrestling with it. He's always been a bit of a loner, even as a kid. He never needed a big group of friends or the constant noise of other people around him. He's always preferred the quiet of home. He doesn't go out much, and he doesn't have close friends, not in the way you'd expect for someone his age. I've tried talking to him about it, tried to figure out if he's lonely or lost, but every time I bring it up, he just shrugs it off with a quick, "I'm fine." But I know better. A mother always knows. He's not fine, no matter how much he tries to convince me otherwise. Then, about a month ago, Maximus dropped a bombshell on me, something I never saw coming. It was late at night, just the two of us in the living room, when he suddenly opened up in a way he never had before. He told me he'd been using my things, my underwear. At first, I didn't get it. My mind couldn't process what he was saying. But when it finally clicked, when I understood what he meant, it felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. My heart raced, my chest tightened, and I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation. But I didn't. I just stood there, frozen, watching him. He looked so small, so ashamed, his eyes glued to the floor, his shoulders hunched like he was carrying the weight of the world. In that moment, I realized this wasn't just about what he'd done. It wasn't about the shock or the anger I felt. It was about something deeper, something he couldn't put into words. This was about his struggle, his confusion, his loneliness, and his fear. And all I could do was sit there with him, trying to understand not just the facts, but the emotions he was grappling with, the ones he didn't know how to express. He wasn't some monster. He was my son, and he was hurting in ways I couldn't fully grasp. I couldn't bring myself to make him feel worse than he already did, so I made a choice. I made a deal with him. I told him he could do what he needed to do, but there would be rules. He could keep doing what he needed to do, but only if it happened in front of me. That way, I could keep an eye on him, make sure he wasn't crossing any more lines. In return, I told him I'd bring whoever I wanted into the house without him questioning or judging me. It wasn't ideal, but in that moment, it was the only solution I could come up with. Since then, things have shifted. Maximus seems calmer, less tense. He still doesn't talk much, but he doesn't avoid me like he used to. And me? I've started to realize this arrangement isn't just for him, it's for me, too. It's given me a kind of freedom I haven't felt in years, the freedom to live my life without constantly worrying about how it affects him. Sometimes, though, late at night, I lie awake and wonder if I made the right call. I think about what people would say if they knew. Would they call me a terrible mother? A failure? Maybe they would. But they don't know Maximus. They don't know what it's like to watch your child struggle and feel completely powerless to help. They don't know what it's like to feel like you're barely holding it together, just trying to keep everything from falling apart. I don't know what the future holds for us. I don't know if this arrangement will last or if it's just a ticking time bomb. But for now, this is our life. It's messy, it's complicated, and it's far from perfect, but I'm doing the best I can for him, for both of us. If you're still with me, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories like this. Trust me, there's a lot more to unpack here. The deal wasn't something I planned. It wasn't something I thought through. It just happened. One minute, I was sitting there, trying to figure out how to talk to Maximus about what he'd told me, and the next, the words were tumbling out of my mouth like they had a life of their own. You can keep doing it, I said, but I need something in return. He looked at me like I'd just spoken in another language. His face went pale, his hands clenched into fists on the kitchen table. For a second, I thought he was going to get up and walk out. Maybe I wanted him to. Maybe I was hoping he'd tell me I was crazy and storm out of the room. But he didn't. He just sat there, staring at me, his mouth opening and closing like he didn't know what to say. What do you mean? He finally asked, his voice shaky, quiet, like he wasn't sure he really wanted to hear the answer. I took a deep breath. I mean, you can keep doing it, but only in front of me. And in return, I get to live my life the way I want. I get to bring people into the house without you saying anything about it. No judgment, no questions. We both get what we need, okay? There was a long silence after that. Maximus didn't say a word. He just stared at me, his brow furrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line. I could tell he was trying to process what I just said, trying to make sense of it. I was doing the same thing. The words were out there now, hanging in the air between us, and I couldn't take them back. Not that I was sure I wanted to. Finally, he nodded, just a little, barely enough to notice. Okay, he said, his voice so soft I almost didn't hear it. If that's what you want. And that was it. That was the deal. The first time it happened, I thought I was going to throw up. I sat on the edge of my bed, my heart pounding, my palms sweating. I told myself this was what he needed, that it was better than the alternative, that I was doing this for him. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. It never is. Maximus walked into the room, his eyes glued to the floor. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. We didn't look at each other, not really. I just sat there, pretending like it wasn't happening, like this was just another normal day. And when it was over, he left, without a word. I didn't move for a long time after that. I just sat there, staring at the wall, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, that this was fine. It's strange, the things you can get used to. At first, every time felt like a punch to the gut. But over time, it got easier. Or maybe I just got better at pretending it didn't bother me. I told myself it wasn't hurting anyone, that it was just different. I told myself I was being practical, that I was making the best out of a bad situation. And for a while, I believed it. Maximus, on the other hand, was a different story. He tried to act like everything was fine, but I could see it in his eyes, the shame, the guilt. He never said it out loud, but I knew he hated himself for needing this, for needing me. And every time I saw that look on his face, it broke my heart a little more. But what was I supposed to do? He was my son, my only child. I couldn't turn my back on him. I couldn't let him drown in his own feelings while I stood by and watched. So I did what I always do. I put on a brave face and pushed forward. For him, for me, for us. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. Most days, I'm not even sure what the right thing is anymore. But this is where we are. This is the life we've built, and for now, it's enough. It has to be. At first, it was just once in the morning, sometimes again in the evening. It wasn't predictable, but it was manageable. I kept telling myself this was just a phase, that Maximus would get tired of it, that it would fade away once the novelty wore off. But I was wrong. Instead of slowing down, it only intensified. What started as a morning thing turned into afternoons, then nights. Soon, it was 2 mornings back to back. I began to notice how the hours of the day seemed to revolve around this arrangement. There were fewer moments of normalcy, fewer times when the air in the house didn't feel heavy with the weight of what we'd agreed to. I tried to ignore it, to push it to the back of my mind, but it was always there, lingering like a shadow I couldn't shake. The first time I felt truly uneasy about it, I was in the middle of folding laundry. Maximus walked in without a word, his expression tense, his body language stiff. I knew what he wanted before he even said anything. I put the clothes down and sat on the edge of the couch, waiting for him to finish. But this time was different. He didn't just leave when it was over. He lingered, looking at me like he was trying to say something but couldn't find the words. My stomach tightened, the weight of the moment pressing down on me like a stone. "You okay?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He nodded, but I could see it in his eyes. This wasn't about relief anymore. It was something more. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the day over and over in my mind. I told myself not to overthink it, that I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew better. This wasn't just a way for him to cope anymore. It was something he was starting to need, something he was beginning to rely on. The scariest part was, I wasn't sure how to stop it. In the days that followed, Maximus's behavior shifted even more. He stopped trying to hide it, stopped waiting for the right moments. It was like he didn't care about boundaries anymore, like the deal we'd made was a free pass to do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. And maybe it was. I had given him the freedom to do this, hadn't I? The first time I teased him, it was an accident. I was in the kitchen, making dinner, when he walked in. I could feel him watching me as I moved around, his eyes following my every step. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I wanted to break the tension, or maybe I was testing him, seeing how far he'd go. But without thinking, I slipped my jacket off, letting it fall onto the counter. His breath hitched, and I turned to face him, a small smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. "Something wrong?" I asked, pretending not to notice the way his cheeks flushed. He didn't answer, he just turned and left the room. But I could feel the weight of his gaze lingering, even after he was gone. After that, it became a game. I'd pull my hair up, let my shirt ride up just a little too high, leave my jeans unbuttoned a little too long. Nothing explicit, nothing overt, just enough to make him squirm, to make him hesitate before turning away. It gave me a strange sense of control, a power I hadn't felt in years, and I hated how much I liked it. But with every passing day, the line between us blurred a little more. He started seeking me out more often, finding excuses to be near me even when he didn't need to be. And I told myself it was harmless, that it didn't mean anything. But the truth was, I wasn't sure what it meant anymore. I wasn't sure of anything. There was a moment, late one evening, when it all came to a head. Maximus was sitting across from me in the living room, his eyes fixed on me as I read a book. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the kind that made your skin prickle and your heart race. I looked up at him, meeting his gaze, and for the first time, I didn't look away. Neither did he. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating, until I finally cleared my throat and stood up. "I'm going to bed," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, but I could feel his eyes on me as I walked away. I don't know how we got here. I don't know how I let it get this far. But here we are, caught in a cycle I'm not sure how to break. And as much as I want to believe I'm still in control, I can't shake the feeling that I've already lost it. It wasn't until Enrique Franklin entered our lives that everything began to unravel. I met him through a friend, one of those casual introductions you never think much about at first. But Enrique wasn't the kind of man you could easily forget. He was charming in a way that felt effortless, like he didn't have to try to make you smile. He had this laugh that filled a room, warm and disarming, and he made me feel lighter, like maybe, for the first time in years, I could let my guard down. Enrique started coming over more often. At first, it was just for dinner or a drink on the back porch, but soon, he was staying later, lingering in the living room after Maximus had retreated to his room. And then, one night, he didn't leave at all. I didn't try to hide it from Maximus. That wasn't part of our deal, after all. Still, I couldn't ignore the look on his face the next morning when he saw Enrique sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee like he'd been there for years. It was subtle, but I knew my son well enough to recognize the tension in his jaw, the way his hands tightened around his plate just a little too hard. At first, Maximus didn't say anything. He just watched from the edges, quiet and sullen. But as the weeks went by and Enrique's presence in our house became more frequent, his silence turned into something sharper. He started snapping at me over little things, forgotten errands, mismatched socks, trivial annoyances that seemed to take on a life of their own. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just Maximus adjusting to the changes. But deep down, I could feel the resentment building between us, thick and heavy, like a storm ready to burst. One evening, as Enrique and I sat on the couch, laughing over something trivial, Maximus walked into the room. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching us with an expression I couldn't quite read. When I looked up and met his eyes, I saw it, the hurt, the anger, the confusion that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. Before I could say anything, he spoke. His voice was low and trembling. "Do you even care anymore?" he said, his words slicing through the air like a knife. Enrique glanced at me, startled, but I didn't take my eyes off Maximus. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice steady even though my heart was pounding. He took a step closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "You don't care about me, about us, about what we're doing, has done to me." The room fell silent. Even Enrique didn't dare to move. I stood up slowly, my chest tight, as I searched Maximus's face for some kind of explanation. "Maximus, that's not true," I said softly. "Of course, I care about you." "For me?" he shot back, his voice rising. "How is any of this for me? You let this guy waltz into our lives like it's nothing. You sit there and laugh with him like I don't even exist." His words hit me harder than I expected, knocking the air out of my lungs. "Maximus," I said, reaching out to him, but he pulled away before I could touch him. "I didn't know you felt this way," I said. "Of course, you didn't," he said bitterly. "You're too busy with your freedom or whatever it is you think this is. Do you even see me anymore, or am I just convenient?" The silence that followed was deafening. Enrique shifted uncomfortably on the couch, muttering something about giving us space before slipping out the door. I barely noticed. All I could see was my son, standing there, trembling with emotions I'd ignored for far too long. That night, after Maximus stormed off to his room, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the empty coffee cup Enrique had left behind. His words kept replaying in my head, over and over, each one cutting a little deeper than the last. He was right. I hadn't been thinking about him, not really. I'd been so focused on trying to make this situation work, on convincing myself that everything was fine, that I hadn't stopped to think about what it was doing to him. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the full weight of my choices, the deal I'd made with Maximus, the boundaries we'd crossed, the lines we'd blurred. It wasn't just about us anymore. It was about what we were becoming and the damage we were leaving in our wake. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, staring at the door, wondering if there was still a way to fix this or if it was already too late. The day after our argument, the house was unnervingly quiet. Maximus stayed in his room, the door closed, the air heavy with unspoken tension. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my coffee, the steam curling up like a fog clouding my thoughts. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to do something. Whatever this was, whatever we had turned our relationship into, it couldn't go on like this. Not for him, not for me. Later that afternoon, I knocked on his door. There was no answer at first, but I waited, pressing my forehead against the wooden frame. "Maximus, please," I said softly. "I need to talk to you." Finally, the door creaked open, and he stood there, his face guarded and his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice trembling. "For everything. For not seeing how much this has hurt you, for letting things get this far. I was wrong." His expression didn't soften immediately, but he stepped aside to let me in. I sat on the edge of his bed while he leaned against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. "We need help," I admitted. "Both of us. I can't keep pretending like I know what I'm doing, and I can't let us keep going down this path. I've already made too many mistakes, but I want to try to fix them, if you'll let me." Maximus didn't say much at first, he just nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. A few days later, we were sitting in a small office across from Rafael Cabrera, a family therapist I'd found online. Rafael was a kind man, his demeanor calm and steady in a way that made you feel safe, even when you didn't want to talk. At first, neither of us did. We sat in silence, the weight of our story too much to put into words. But Rafael had a way of breaking through that silence, asking questions that didn't feel like prying but like invitations. Slowly, Maximus began to open up. He talked about the loneliness he'd felt since the divorce, the confusion he carried about our arrangement, and the resentment that had been building inside him. I listened, tears streaming down my face as I heard him put words to feelings I'd ignored for far too long. In the weeks that followed, therapy became a part of our routine. It wasn't easy. There were days when we left the office more drained than when we arrived, days when I questioned if we were really making progress. But bit by bit, the walls between us began to come down. Raphael helped us set boundaries, real boundaries this time. I told Maximus that our deal was over, that it had been a mistake, and that we needed to start fresh. At first, he struggled to adjust. There were moments when I caught him retreating to old habits, his frustration boiling over into anger or tears. But with Raphael's guidance, we found healthier ways to cope. Maximus started journaling, something I never thought he'd try, and even joined a local martial arts class, where he found an outlet for his emotions. Slowly, I saw him change. He stood a little taller, spoke a little more confidently, and began spending more time out of the house, building connections that weren't tethered to me. For me, the hardest part was facing myself, really facing myself. Therapy forced me to confront the choices I'd made, the ways I'd let my own fears and insecurities dictate my relationship with Maximus. I'd spent so much time trying to hold on to him, to fill the void left by the divorce, that I hadn't seen how it was suffocating us both. Letting go of that control, learning to trust that he could stand on his own, was one of the hardest things I've ever done. One evening, months after our first therapy session, Maximus and I were sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was warm, the kind of quiet that feels peaceful rather than heavy. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were going to be okay. Not perfect, but okay. And sometimes, that's enough. He looked over at me and said, "Thanks, Mom, for everything." It wasn't much, but it was enough. I reached over and squeezed his hand, a simple gesture that spoke volumes without needing words. We're still figuring things out. Healing isn't a straight line. It's messy and complicated, full of setbacks and small victories. But for the first time in a long time, I feel hopeful. Maximus is finding his way, and so am I. And while we may never fully erase the mistakes we've made, we're learning how to move forward together. Life doesn't come with a manual, and if it did, I probably would have thrown mine out a long time ago. Maximus and I have been through more than I ever imagined we could handle, but somehow, we're still here. Still trying. Still learning. The house feels different now, lighter, somehow. Maybe there's a kind of peace that comes from knowing we're finally working towards something better. Maximus has found his footing. He spends more time out with friends, more time focusing on his own interests, and when we do cross paths, it feels like we're meeting as individuals, not as two people tied up in a messy arrangement we didn't fully understand. We still have our moments, of course. Healing isn't perfect, but it's progress. For me, it's been a journey of facing myself. I've had to learn to forgive my own mistakes, to let go of the guilt that weighed me down for so long. I've had to accept that I can't always fix things, and sometimes the best thing you can do for someone you love is to step back and let them figure it out for themselves. It hasn't been easy, but I'm proud of the progress we've made, not just as a mother and son, but as two people learning how to respect and trust each other again. If there's one thing I've taken away from all of this, it's the importance of boundaries, real ones. They're not just rules, they're acts of love. Love for the people around you and love for yourself. They're how you protect what matters while still allowing room for growth, for understanding, for connection. I've learned that accountability is just as important as forgiveness, that sometimes the hardest thing you can do is admit you've been wrong. But it's also the most freeing. To anyone listening, I want to say this: mistakes don't define you. What defines you is what you do after, how you pick yourself up, how you face the people you've hurt, and how you move forward. Growth isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to change, even when it scares you, even when it hurts. Maximus and I are still figuring things out, and I think we always will be. That's just life. But for the first time in a long time, I feel like we're on solid ground. We're building something better, something healthier, and I know we'll keep moving forward together.